Welcome to the Be What You Want podcast. My name's Chris Hall, and today I've got the honor of having Dr. Laurel Shaler on the line. Now, Dr. Shaler is an author, but also a licensed counsellor. She's also an academic working for the Liberty University in Virginia, and she does a range of work. And today we're going to talk about many of the distinctions that she comes across in her counselling practice, but also that she's written about in her book, which is called Relational Reset. Dr. Laurel Shaler's passion is all about helping women thrive in their relationships. And today we're going to tap into various distinctions on that in terms of how we can reset when things need to be reset, how we can overcome trauma, and how we can just tackle this subject, because human beings are complicated. So we need to understand how we can relate to each other in better ways. And that's what this conversation is all about. So Dr. Laurel Shaler, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Okay, so look, let's get to know each other through the conversation. This is what it's all about. Let me ask you a kind of a broad opening question that may come from the heart. Through the work that you do, what type of world are you trying to create?
Well, I would like to see a world where people experience freedom from the burden of emotional, mental, and relational problems. And it's not to say that we won't struggle, but that we can get to a point where we have less struggles or struggle less with our problems. And I'd like to see less stigma surrounding these issues and the treatment of these issues, in particular related to the church, because I see that a lot of the time the church is kind of a barrier to people seeking out help. Because there's a perception that you don't need any outside help. So I'd like to help people see that even church-going people can partner with licensed mental health professionals to find relief from their suffering.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. There's a parallel to AA there that I'd like to draw upon, which is one of the first principles of Alcoholics Anonymous, is that I think it's that you give up, that you have control over the situation and you give up to a higher power, right? So there's almost a religious context to that, isn't there? That willingness to surrender the fact that you need help, which I think is very relevant, whether it comes to relationships, overcoming trauma, etc.
Yeah, and you're right. That's basically, it is the first step in AA. And even, the founding of AA, it was a little bit more specific about what that higher power might look like. But now it's a little bit broader and kind of embracing to people from a wide variety of backgrounds, but to be able to recognize that we really can't do this on our own, that we need something beyond ourselves.
Absolutely. And when it comes to that reaching out for help, and as you quite rightly said, almost like the stigma that can be attached to either relationship issues, trauma, whatever it is you need to overcome, it's actually very common. We all go through these things and we all have it within. It's just sometimes some people bury it down and never deal with it. Some people don't know how quite to ask for help, etc. And so, yeah, I completely agree. We need to make it not a stigma and to openly talk about it. And perhaps even this conversation is one of the many ways that we can do so.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, let's make a link to the types of things that can, manifest in our lives as a result. Let kind of focusing on relationships for a second. When our relationships aren't going well, how does it hold us back in other areas within our life?
Yeah, I think about those times when maybe we've sent an email or a text message and we're anxiously waiting for a reply, and we almost obsessively check our email or check our cell phone to the point to where we're distracted from what we're supposed to be paying attention to, whether it's a movie or our work or even a dinner with somebody else in our life. We just become consumed by the fact that the relationship isn't going well. And oftentimes we focus on that and we obsess over that, and we ignore the other things in our life. So it not only does it mean that we're having a problem in that relationship, and that relationship is being harmed and not healthy and not going the way we'd like it to, but at the same time, it's interfering with the relationships and the other aspects of our entire life. So we really have to be aware that even if a single relationship isn't going well, it can really have ramifications for everything that is in our whole world.
Absolutely. I mean, on that as an example, I want to see your take on this. Sometimes in life, we do need to bring up things courageously, and that might be especially in our careers or in our businesses. So, for example, there might be times where we bring up something courageously that actually is technically a conflict, right? And then on a personal level, what that means is it requires courage. It requires courage to send that email, which, may be requesting something of someone or bringing something up that's not okay, etc. And that definitely for me is an example that, it can bring up that anxiety that you just talked about, and that can stop you from having, a pleasant dinner with your partner, for example. So it's interesting, isn't it? Because as much as things can bring up anxiety, it's about basically finding a way to be okay with that as well, isn't it? You can't be afraid of conflict too in life. What would you think of that?
Right, because a lot of the time fear prevents us from addressing conflict because we are afraid of the result. We're afraid that the other person will have a negative reaction, or maybe they'll just tell us to, get out of their lives permanently. So we kind of have this fear that if we don't confront a problem, then we might run the risk of damaging the relationship even further. So instead we just kind of ruminate on it and we think about it all the time, over and over. We just dwell on it rather than actually address the problem and give ourselves the opportunity to repair the relationship and to see our life come back into this place of homeostasis, understanding that life is always going to be a series of ups and downs. And so it's not to say that you're not going to have another conflict, but if we don't ever address the conflict, then it's just like this snowball that just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger as it rolls down the hill. And ultimately it's just going to crash.
Absolutely. And I love someone drew a visual of this for me once, and it really connected with me. Imagine you've got a wheel and you've got the hub of the wheel and you've got the spokes. And the idea is that when you don't address an area that needs to be addressed, and this could be an area of, either conflict or confrontation or whatever it is, just needs to be brought up. If we don't do that, it's like knocking out the spoke from the wheel. And over time, the relationship, like the wheel, becomes less workable because it's lost its structural integrity because you're hiding something and not being authentic to the relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great metaphor. And think about if all the spokes start to come out, what's the result? We also in counseling look at a three-legged stool and we talk about what happens if one of the legs of those stools breaks off. So how we have to work on repairing that leg and making sure that in the process of repairing that leg, we don't do something that causes one of the others to break off in the meantime. So it can be difficult when you're trying to manage multiple relationships at once, but it would be very rare for us not to be engaged in multiple relationships at once. So, because we're not just talking about romantic relationships, of course, we're talking about friendships, we're talking about relationships with colleagues, neighbors, members of church, members of community groups that you're involved in. So we're just talking about a wide range of relationships. So we're going to have lots of those all at the same time. And so trying to balance them all can be really difficult. But if there's something that's interfering with a relationship, that's when you might take a step back and say, okay, I need to do something different to improve this relationship. And hopefully that may result in improving other relationships as well.
Absolutely. And I think this also links to habit, because this can be one-on-one with people, but then one can get into a habit of perhaps not addressing certain things because of some of the things we just discussed. And I believe in your book, you talk about things like that. It can be some of the bad habits can be around areas such as wounds, insecurity, blame, envy. And so, for example, if we get insecurity coming up, it might make us not courageous to have a conflict with someone. But just kind of going, into the area of wounds, for example, when we've got our own wounds from the past, and that be from trauma or previous relationships, etc. What are some of the, I want to address two things here. I want to talk about the habits. I want to talk about how wounds can lead to bad habits. And I also want to think about what are some of the main typical types of past wounds that can bring up bad habits within relationships.
Yeah, so you're right. When our past always is going to impact the present, if we let it. I mean, we can do some work to try and prevent ourselves from allowing the past impact our present. And it's really unfortunate because oftentimes somebody that we're in a relationship with now doesn't even have that background information, or may not be thinking about our past, even if we've shared it with them before. And they may be wondering, okay, what's really going on here? Why are you getting so upset about something that seems so small, without recognizing that it's a reminder of something from the past, that, maybe you had a father that left the family, or maybe you had a very good friend when you were a teenager that passed away in a car accident, or you had something traumatic happen. And so you have something in the present that happens. And it's a reminder of those terrible things. And the person that you're in a relationship with now isn't even thinking of that. And they don't mean to bring that up through the way that they're interacting with you, but it does. It spurs something on. And again, it's that trigger. And so you react in a negative way, and then you find that you just kind of get into this turmoil when really it's because it's a reminder of something from your past that maybe you haven't dealt with. So the past can definitely impact the present. And another way that it can impact the present is based on the way that we learn attachment through our initial caregiver. So we're going to either learn to be securely attached or insecurely attached to people based on how we're attached to our primary caregivers from the time that we're born, and some say even before, from the time that we're in the womb. So how does that attachment style impact our present relationship? So we have to be aware of whether we have a history of secure attachment. So we're able to easily know where we begin and the other person ends, or vice versa. We're able to feel safe and secure in a relationship. We're not constantly afraid that the person's going to leave us or abandon us. And at the same time, recognizing whether or not we struggle with anxiety in our relationships or whether we struggle with avoidance. You were talking about avoidance earlier, not being able to address conflict. Sometimes that's an issue as well, is that we just don't want to deal with the negative stuff going on because we have an avoidant, insecure attachment style.
Fascinating. I mean, those first two ones were around. One was, I guess, the abandonment scenario. You can have an abandonment situation in your childhood, for example. And there's a link there also to the general dynamic of either secure or insecure primary carer relationship. Both of those things, like if we then translates that to a relationship dynamic in your adulthood, I suppose it could be an example of some of the bad habits that could happen. It could be that whoever it is, a friend, a colleague, your partner, they could be bringing up a subject matter which to them is just about the subject matter. They could be more factual based, analytical, and they're just saying, hey, this is what's going on, X, Y, Z. And all they're trying to do is convey the content of that subject matter. But for the receiver, because they've got that wound, they can make the meaning, the interpretation that, oh, they're bringing up something here that if I don't respond in the right way, they're going to leave me.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right. So then we're left with all this fear. The not only fear of abandonment, you have the fear of insecurity. We're just struggling with this constant anxiety, which is really excessive worry about something that probably won't happen, and we don't even have any evidence that it's going to happen. There are not any indicators. There's no clues that it's going to happen. But what's really going on is it's rooted in a past experience, and so that's what triggers the fear in the present.
Right. So it's interesting because you've got there's two ways that you can become aware of this. You can have a counselor-like relationship where you go to therapy and you become aware of that. And I'm sure that's what you do all the time. Or I guess you can also become aware of these subject matters and just become a conscious human being, right? And maybe you didn't ever need to go to therapy, but you become aware of it. So can we kind of bring those things together for a second? And, how can we help people understand the insecurity on the personal level is kicking in and it's kind of nothing to do with what the other person is saying? What are some of the ways that we can recognize that, like, insecurity is kicking in and that's just for me now? When do we see the red light going off?
Yeah, and I love the way that you worded that, and it's really important that we're focusing on our own security versus insecurity, and that it's not all about looking at other people and trying to identify the issues that are with them. I can't tell you the number of clients that have come to see me and what they really wanted was for a way to fix someone else in their life. And I'm like, well, they're not here, so I can't help you fix them. The only person that can really make any change in their life is you. You can make a change in your own life. And so that's what I think that's the first step, is recognizing it's not about trying to change other people. It's about working on the ways that we can change so that we can have healthier, whole relationships. And so I do believe a big part of that is recognizing our security, recognizing whether or not we're somebody who tends to feel unsafe in relationships, whether we frequently consider leaving someone that, and again, it doesn't have to be a romantic partner, but it could even just be a friendship. Well, that person didn't call me back. I'm just not going to deal with them anymore. I'm not going to worry about them. I'm not going to call them again. We just allow ourselves to get worked up, and oftentimes it's over nothing. But it's something that we've created. I call it mind reading, and not in like the mentalist kind of way where you're literally reading someone's mind, but it's where you assume you know what someone's thinking when you really don't. So when that friend doesn't call you back in the time frame that you think they should, you assume they're angry with you. They don't want to have anything to do with you. They don't like you. They don't want to be your friend. And so you're going to get out ahead of that and say, well, I'll just forget them first. And ultimately, it's not a good way to react to things, because we wind up really suffering and not having the types of relationships that I really believe we were designed to have.
Absolutely. And that's a really very tangible, real life example that we all experience in business and also in our personal lives. And I think for those of the listeners out here that are watching or listening to this and they've not had kids yet, one little nugget of wisdom that I would like to give them as now a parent myself is that when you leave a message for a parent, they are on parent time. They've got to like deal with the screaming baby, bath time, bedtime. They're exhausted. They're not sleeping. They're this or that. They love you and they still care about you. It's just that, literally life can be so hectic with either a newborn or a toddler, for example, that it's not about that they don't care about you and you don't need to feel insecure about it. It's just that it's hectic being a parent. And it's really important to remember that. That's an example of that, isn't it?
I love that example because I have a 2-year-old daughter. So I'm like, right there. And it's like, yes. And so this is what we call empathy, is being able to put ourselves in someone else's shoes and to be able to think through, okay, maybe there's something going on in their life that's preventing them from contacting me, and it really doesn't have anything to do with me. Maybe I can consider that they have an aging parent, they have a young child, they have a big project at work, they're in the process of selling their house, whatever the case may be, that we're able to think through what might it be like if I put myself in their shoes. And if we can conjure up some empathy, it really helps us to reduce our defenses and not to become so easily offended or upset or angry or disappointed, or any of those negative emotions that might come up as a result.
And then that's all like the self-perception of the person that's either secure or insecure. And that's how it's like in the eyes of the perceiver there. But also, and also you mentioned the word defensive, we'd have to get defensive. I think it's also important to add on top of that, not to be on the attack. Because let's imagine, going beyond the parent example, what about if your friend or family member is going through a health scare? And what about if they've just lost a loved one and you don't know yet? It's very important that in those situations, you must remember that you just don't know, right? So true empathy and compassion will never go on the attack, because in those moments, imagine your friend is completely vulnerable because they've gone through something horrible. You just don't know yet. And imagine in that moment, you throw some metaphorical acid into the relationship and you make it about you and your insecurity. Do you know what's going to happen? You're going to lose them, because they're going to say, how on earth could you be so horrible to me when I've just lost my grandmother or my partner or my whatever, or I've had this health scare? You didn't know and you weren't there for me. It's amazing how one's own insecurity can turn you around and bite you on the bottom, quite frankly.
Yeah, I can think of some real life true examples of that. Had some dear friends a few months ago that they lost their precious teenage son in a car accident. And I remember the mom sharing with me about someone that contacted her and she hadn't gotten back with them as quickly as they wanted. And the person's reply was something like, "You really hurt my feelings by not getting back in touch with me." And she's like, that my son was just killed in an accident. It's like, I just can't wrap my mind around that. And I think that's the big issue, is we just don't have empathy for people. We've become so selfish. It's all about us and getting our needs met, that we can't even put ourselves in someone else's shoes and recognize that, that it's not about us. Even if my friend had gotten back in touch with her and was not kind to her, like, leave me alone, I'm going through something horrible right now, you should still be able to have some empathy because of the deep depth of grief that this person would be going through. So we have to offer some people not just empathy but grace, being able to say, Okay, I've been treated with kindness and compassion and forgiveness, and I want to extend that to other people, instead of just always, yes, I love use the word attack, going on the attack towards others because they don't act exactly like we want them to act.
Gosh, absolutely. Now, I mean, that really shows that there's an importance to do this work, because actually there's an impact on relationship, and it's the idea that it's not just for your own benefit, it's for the benefit of your life and the workability of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So look, going on to a slightly different realm, but it's all kind of linked. In terms of blame, right? The idea that we can blame this is when we can take sometimes what's going on for us and we can project that onto someone else in our life. Now, it's very, very common that blame really is not very productive. So it is definitely something to be worked on. But let me ask you a somewhat academic distinction. Is there actually genuinely blame that should be done because it's accurate, and actually you need to call people out, and you, shall we say, should blame them for that without wanting to sound harsh? Is there like true legitimate blame versus unproductive blame?
Yeah, yes, I think there is a difference. And the way that I would phrase this is all about level of responsibility. So being able to look at what is my part of this and what is someone else's part of this. I use an activity that actually is called the level of responsibility, and it's just a scale of 0 to 100. And I've used this many times with clients to try to help them tease apart something that's gone on in their life. What part of it belongs to them? What part can they own? And oftentimes a client would come in and they would feel 100% guilty for whatever it is, whether it's a sexual assault or whether it's being involved in a car accident, whatever the case may be that they're suffering from. They've taken all the blame on. And what we start to do is tease it apart and look at, okay, do you have any level of responsibility here? And does anybody else have any level of responsibility? And it's interesting when you do that and you're able to see that, yeah, there are times when it's not all me. I've taken on 100% of the blame, 100% of the guilt, and it's not all me. Sometimes somebody else is involved. And I have to be able to release that portion of the blame and allow that to land on that person. And if you're in a relationship with that person, any type of relationship, being able to work through that together, where you each acknowledge your part. I think that sometimes the best response to conflict is when two individuals are able to recognize that they each had a part in that conflict, and they're able to ask for forgiveness. I remember playing some games years ago with some couples on a retreat, and we were up late and playing this game. I think it was Risk, and things get kind of testy when you're playing a game like that. And I wound up saying, I'm sorry for kind of having a bad attitude here. And a couple of the people were like, no, we're sorry. So with everyone being able to kind of recognize, oh, you know what? It's not just one person that's being testy here. We're all being testy here. So let's all recognize our level of responsibility and not just blame each other for the problem here, but each be able to apologize, to accept forgiveness, and to receive forgiveness. Well, accept and give and receive, pardon me, to give and receive.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there's a few things to kind of that you can unpack there, shall we say. And one of them is that, in relation to, for example, sexual trauma, if one had been, say, raped or something horrendous like that, that I think links to meaning, and the idea that, the book's written on this. I think Viktor Frankl, I think Man's Meaning-Making Machine, right? And the idea in those distinctions and a lot of personal development courses is that whatever happens to one is distinct and different from the meaning that we make out of it. So in that example of responsibility and someone going through a rape, for example, as well as the responsibility thing, the person that has suffered that abuse, they can make a meaning that I am unworthy, I am dirty, I am something like that. And when we can help people make a split between the fact that, yeah, absolutely it was not their responsibility, this was done to them. But in addition to that as well, this label that we put in our own mind about the way we think about ourselves as a result. If we can say, actually, you know what? This happened to me and I made this up, should we say? I own that story because it was so traumatic, but the owning of the fact that you, should we say, make that meaning, that can be the very moment of liberation where you can say, I wasn't responsible for this and I can now let go. I can let go this negative, conundrum that I've put upon myself.
Yeah, and that actually is really the basis of some forms of treatment for trauma. Since, we have that example before us, is being able to look at alternative ways of thinking about the trauma. And it's not that you're thinking about it in a way that's not true. You're not going to try and shift the story to where, you make it out to be something positive when it was something negative, but that you're able to look at it in a different way. So if somebody did have a sexual assault and their belief was it's all my fault, and as a result they feel really guilty, being able to change that belief of it's all my fault, so then they may be able to look at their level of responsibility and say, okay, these were some of the things that I would do different in the future, but I am 0% responsible for the sexual assault. That 100% falls on the perpetrator. So I don't have to feel guilty for having this horrible abuse done to me. And what can I do different in the future to learn from it? Again, you're talking about Man's Search for Meaning and Viktor Frankl. I mean, he's not really considered a prisoner of war because he was not in the military, but he was a prisoner during World War II, and he was a physician, and he was held by the Nazis, and he went through horrible suffering, but he did try to determine what he could learn and to find some hope in his day-to-day life. And what he discovered is that those who lost hope didn't survive. They couldn't find anything to live for. And so he was striving to find something to live for in the day-to-day, even if it was something that maybe wasn't like tangible. It wasn't like he had a calendar and he knew that he was going to get out one day. He didn't know, but that's what he was looking for. So how can we find meaning in suffering? And I think it can be really difficult because, it's so unfair that these terrible things happen. I mean, I remember working with groups of women who had been sexually traumatized, and just I was so empathetic to the anger that they felt, but ultimately that anger was not productive for them. It's like they were holding their own heads underwater. They were still suffering. So then how can we say 100% not responsible for what happened to you? Now, what do we do with this so that you can move on in freedom in your life?
Absolutely. And on the meaning element and Viktor Frankl and on all these things, there are some personal development schools, like you can go to a seminar and you go for a weekend, you can do it. It's great. And what they'll do sometimes is they'll give you this distinction, but the conclusion of them, which I don't think is fully constructive, is that life is literally not about meaning and we can take everything apart and there's no meaning to anything. I don't think that's fully constructive because it can tend towards nihilism in terms of, everything, nothing has no meaning. The way I look at it is that we can give people the apparatus, like we just said. We can talk about responsibility. We can talk about, transmuting a negative meaning into something more constructive going forward. That's my point. I think that we can accept that we can, should we say, learn to acknowledge and hopefully discard some of the less constructive and negative meanings and should we say eject them from our lives, but in the vacuum that's left, and this is the important bit that I think's very necessary, we are feeling creatures, we are human beings. So I think we need to, within that vacuum of ejection, we then need to fill it in with something that is meaningful in a positive, loving and constructive way for our life going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And truly the basis for my books and my work is on the Christian faith. And so that's what I found to fill my life. But you're right. People have to find something to fill them and to replace those negative things that they're trying to get rid of. So if we just leave that space open, we leave ourselves vulnerable for something negative to come back in.
Right. So I suppose there's the multiple ways that one can do it. You can do it, the meaning at the whole heart level, the individual level, your relationship in terms of everyone else around you in your life. And of course, with either spirituality or religion. So like literally, if you're in the Christian faith, that could be, it's through my connection with God, with Jesus, etc., that literally I can find a meaning that draws me forward in my life, right?
Yes, absolutely. That's where your hope comes from. That's where your help comes from.
Very, very good point. And that yeah, I almost forgot that bit for a second. It's important, isn't it? So we're talking about what we're covering here is personal awareness across the scale of responsibility, meanings that we make, and hope, and how we can shift, transmute, and transform so that we have a great way forward. It gives me shivers. It really does, because it's so powerful for setting up someone with a way forward in their life. And I think it's crucial work. I think that's a good segue to the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which is in your work, you also cover post-traumatic stress disorder and healing trauma. And then your book, you also talk about reclaiming sanity, which I think is a great phrase, reclaiming sanity. I believe there's a phrase, correct me if I'm wrong, there's the 5 myths around anger and how we can overcome them. Could you just unpack this all a little bit in terms of trauma, PTSD, the 5 myths of anger, and tell us about that, because that fascinates me.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so reclaiming sanity is about trauma and stress and overwhelming life events. And the trauma piece definitely covers PTSD, but it also covers traumatic experiences that don't result in that formal diagnosis, but might result in other emotional health problems that people are struggling with. Maybe they're dealing with anxiety or panic attacks or depression or trouble with sleep, or they're, again, relationship issues or anger, and they're not really sure why. But as they start to explore what may be triggering those negative feelings and emotions and experiences, they realize that maybe it's rooted in something that they've experienced in the past. So I think it's just important that people understand that you can go through something traumatic and suffer and not have the diagnosis of PTSD. But many people who go through trauma, about 10% will experience a PTSD as a result. And I love talking about anger and the problems with anger, but also the myths surrounding anger. And so, yeah, let's go through a few of those here. And the first one is, if I don't get angry, people will think I'm weak. So we're so afraid of being looked at as passive or doormats, especially if we've been through something tough in the past. And we're like, no, I'm going to stand up for myself this time. I'm not going to let this happen again. So then we decide that we have to be angry, even to the point of being aggressive. But the reality is, it takes much more strength to stay in control and to stay calm. I mean, it's like, if you're on the phone with a telemarketer, like, which is easier, being calm and polite, or being angry and, like, telling them off and hanging up on them? Like, it's easier to get mad at a telemarketer that's just, awakened your child, right? Well, but because they've called you. But the reality is that it is easier to get angry with them. So we have to recognize that it takes a lot more strength to stay in control and to stay calm and to keep our emotions level. So that's the first myth. If I don't get angry, people will think I'm weak. But the truth is that we have the capability of staying in control of our emotions, and that it actually demonstrates more strength when we stay in control. And the second myth is that we shouldn't keep our anger bottled up.
Okay.
This kind of is rooted in kind of probably 20 years ago with anger management, and looking at what do you do with anger. And so, do we keep it bottled up? Do we allow it to explode? But ultimately, we don't have to do either of those things. We don't have to keep our emotions buried, but we don't have to let them out in a really aggressive way, because when we are aggressive, it reinforces aggressiveness. So then we develop this bad habit. And so we're just continuing to remain angry. So we have to learn how to manage our frustration, being able to discern and distinguish when it's time to be assertive and when it's time to address something, but then also when it's time to maybe let something go. So that's the second myth, the myth is I shouldn't keep my anger bottled up, so I have to let it out. But the truth is, we don't have to keep it bottled up or let it explode.
Wow. Yeah. Gosh. I mean, I also relate to, for example, if someone passes away and you're going through a grieving process, that can bring up anger. And I think during such times, it can be that other people look at you and think, why are they not feeling a certain way this time? And one of the things I'm sure a lot of people know from grieving is that there are different stages, and every day is slightly different. Every hour is different. And so, yeah, it's important to realize that you should never try to project being a certain way according to expectations of other people.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah, that's right.
That's not healthy. That's not authentic. And then the PTSD thing, this kind of opens up an interesting area for me, because when we say the phrase PTSD, I think a lot of people associate that with military, right? Coming back from war.
Absolutely.
But what I'm also hearing from you as well is that it exists in other realms. Is that right? Like it can be manifested from all sorts.
100% true. And I used to work here in America for the Department of Veterans Affairs. So I have a lot of experience in working with veterans and combat veterans who develop PTSD. You can develop it from sexual trauma, from car accidents, from house fires, from childhood abuse. I mean, there's so many different types of trauma. And I think we have to be careful about kind of labeling it and putting it in a box. I mean, there is an official diagnosis that says, you have to meet XYZ criteria.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is that there are times that trauma can be somewhat subjective. And certainly we know that two people could be in the same vehicle and have an accident, and one person could develop PTSD and one person may not develop it. So there's a lot of other factors, like what happens before the accident. Were one of those two people in the vehicle, had they previously experienced trauma? So if they're receiving repetitive traumatic events in their lives, they're more likely to develop PTSD. Or what about what happens afterwards? Say the two people in the car are not in the same family, and one goes home to a loving, supportive family who's there for them and checks in with them and takes them to a counselor and takes them to a church and holds their hand and cries with them. And the other one goes home and there's nobody there, and nobody calls them and nobody checks on them, and they don't go to a counselor, and they don't have a community, and they don't have a church. So what happens after the traumatic event also makes a big it's a big determination as to whether or not you're going to develop PTSD.
Gosh, that's so humbling, isn't it? I mean, right. So for any of the listeners out there that, maybe you have anger come up for you at certain points in your life, you're not sure why. It sounds like basically tackling the 5 myths of anger, which is in your book, is the mechanism, one of the mechanisms to reclaiming your sanity, because you can kind of understand how you can either let some things go or kind of recognize that it's okay to be a certain way at certain moments.
Right. And I think, out of the 5, I just want to share one more, and that's that if I can't help it if others make me angry. And this is one of the things when I would facilitate anger management groups, I would really hone in on this myth that other people are making us mad. But the reality is that we do have control of our emotions, that our emotional responses are our responsibility. And it's not to say that people should be blamed for, struggling with anxiety or depression. That's not what I mean here. But we do have control over whether or not we get angry with someone or something. And instead of blaming other people for our frustrations and saying, you make me mad, or you make me so angry, that makes me so angry, instead we can own our own responsibility. And instead, maybe we say, I'm angry at the situation, or I'm frustrated with so-and-so. And just being able to put it back on us and taking ownership of our anger. It's a challenge, but it also is a mechanism of being able to take back control. And oftentimes people who have experienced trauma feel like they don't have any control of their life. And this is an area that you can take back control, is your emotional responses.
Spot on. Absolutely right. There's a reason these things can come up, and we can take responsibility for them. One of the reasons these things can come up is about, trauma and needing to heal trauma. I'm fascinated in your vast experience of what you've done. What are some of the most effective strategies for healing and addressing trauma?
Well, I think truly if somebody has had a traumatic experience, whether or not they've developed PTSD, I really believe in mental health treatment and being able to go for mental health treatment. And we use what's called evidence-based therapies for post-traumatic stress disorder. And there's only a handful of things that have been demonstrated to be truly effective. So I definitely recommend that because you could go through a very specific protocol, and they're not long, 12 weeks, 16 weeks. For those that have been suffering for years and decades, that's just a really short amount of time to be able to actually find some relief. So I really believe in that. And then, of course, again, from the perspective and the worldview that I come from, being able to turn to Jesus, to rely on your faith, can make a big difference. And it's not like a pat answer like, oh, just read your Bible more, pray more, go to church more. That's not what I mean. But to really be able to dig in to a type of discipleship program where you can really work through your experiences, but through a biblical lens and a biblical worldview. And sometimes those two things can be married by finding a mental health professional that also works in the realm of religious or spiritual integration.
Absolutely. And really, there's a link there, isn't there, to faith and hope, actually. There's a direct link, and it makes sense.
Absolutely.
It makes sense. Okay, so in relation to all the answers you just said, there's different realms in which we can tackle these things. We talked about counseling and programs, and talked about religion, faith, spirituality, all of this. There's also counseling, psychiatry, and psychology, and there are different practices, but there are indeed overlaps. What's your perspective on how? Because the thing is, if you go to a psychiatrist, they might prescribe you some drugs, right? Because a psychiatrist has the ability to do so. If you go to a counselor, you go through a counseling process. They're different, right? So how do we, as, shall we say, the consumer of any of these services, knowing that they are different and they have a particular perspective, each one, how do we navigate how we choose which ones to apply? Because it's a complex area, isn't it? And you've got to always be aware that you are in a particular practice and a particular methodology. How do we navigate whether we need just one or multiple, etc.?
Yeah, I really love this question because I'm both a counselor and a social worker. So I get, people do ask, what's the difference between all these? And even clients will come and they'll say, what's the difference between these different professions? So it is important to understand the difference. And you've already highlighted one important distinction, is that psychiatry is predominantly about medication management and prescribing psychotropic medications. Some psychiatrists do provide psychotherapy services, but most are focused on prescribing medication. And so if somebody needs that, that's who they're going to want to see. And you can almost always see a psychiatrist and someone else who's going to provide therapy. So all the rest of the professions, they're varied, but counseling, psychology, marriage and family therapy, professional counselors, they provide therapy type services. Psychologists oftentimes will also offer psychological testing, though not always. So understanding that the biggest difference is really about the lens that they treat people from. So social workers oftentimes will look at more of a kind of a systemic perspective. Family systems is really common in social work. Marriage and family, of course, they're going to look at, whether it's a structural family therapy or a strategic family therapy, they're going to be looking at kind of the family dynamics and how that impacts the problems for that the identified client is presenting with. Whether or not the family members are there is not always the point. And then you have counselors who are licensed mental health professionals, and they're able to provide the same type of interventions most places that some of these other professionals are. But you really can see a number of professionals depending on what your needs are. But in particular, seeing a psychiatrist for medication and then seeing one of the other mental health professionals for counseling or therapy services.
Absolutely. So I think, if one ever is partaking in such services, I think, this is great as a great answer. And it's a great awareness about, if your gut or mind or heart tells you that what we're covering right now is great and relevant, but I also feel like there's just something else that I also need, then it's great to always ask for help and just follow your instinct, because I think that's the place, and that's the sort of the duty, isn't it, of a practitioner to say, if your client tells you, look, I believe with everything you're telling me about the family stuff here, but I feel like I need something else to help me, then that's the duty of care, isn't it, to refer onto other services. So to round things off, we covered a lot in our chat today. We've talked about blame, we talked about insecurity, how we can look for the red flags of insecurity, how we can look at anger. And I want to ask you a broad question, because your book is about relational reset, and I'm sure it covers a lot. Just to kind of bring it all together, are there any other elements and threads of theme that you address in the book in addition to these subjects that we've covered?
Yeah, so like you said, we've really hit the nail on the head with several of these when we talk about dispelling the past, insecurity, blame, dealing with envy. How does jealousy impact our relationships? And it certainly does. Also, how can we communicate in a way that's most effective? So I call that talking straight. How can we get rid of judgment towards other people? And sometimes that's even towards ourselves. And that includes some of the mind reading that we talked about about. So it's really kind of a broad look at the things that might be red flags in our own lives that indicate we need some help so that we can work from our perspective on improving our relationships. And again, not so much about trying to change the other person, but what can we do for us?
Absolutely. And look, it's and correct me if I'm wrong, it's called Relational Reset for a reason. It's whenever you recognize that these things are happening, A, you can recognize them, and B, you've now got the tools to reset things so that you can continue having a healthy relationship with whoever it is in your life, sorry, not your wife. Very good. Well, listen, it's been I love these talks because, you know, to be frank with you, this is why I love being married to my wife, because we were able to have this level of conversation. She actually comes from a psychology and counseling background. So I love it when you can have people in your life that can talk like this, because it's really helpful. And I hope that for our audience, and I know it has been for me, been very useful to kind of take some of these things apart and understand them more deeply. If people want to either follow you online or your work or to buy the book, where's the best place for people to go to?
Yeah, so I do have a website, drlaurelshaler.com, and I'm at Dr. Laurel Shaler on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. And then, of course, you can purchase my books through Amazon.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Laurel Shaler, it's been a pleasure having a chat with you today. All the best with the fine work that you're doing, and thank you very much for your intention and time here today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.